Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Calcium Products Summer of 2023 webinar series. My name is Andrew Hoiberg. I'm the Vice President of Research and Development here at Calcium Products. Do several different things at the company, one of which is to kind of oversee and direct all the technical support. So that's why we're here today doing some product training, general overview of the products and some usage information and things along those lines. So again, thanks for joining us. And if you are interested in asking any questions, there's a chat window that I've got opened up on my end. So if you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, please feel free to type those in there, and we'll try and address those as they come in. So without any further ado, we'll go ahead and get started here. First thing we'll do is kind of cover a little bit of the company overview, some of the history of the company, and some information regarding our raw materials and how they came to be, and how we have good access to those. Then we'll move down to SO4, our pelletized gypsum, talk mainly about the sulfur release and sulfur component of this product, but also touch a little bit on the soil mending side of things. We'll move on to 98G, talk about correction and especially maintenance of soil pH. That's something we're putting a lot of energy into right now, and we're looking forward to sharing some of that information with you. And then we'll try and leave a few minutes at the end for you to type in any additional questions you might have. I'll go ahead and preface this whole thing by saying that while we do make these webinars available, we'd really like the chance to get in front of you through your territory sales manager and have a one-on-one meeting with some of the individual dealers. And that's a service that we do offer, is coming into your location and doing a bit of a deeper dive than what we'll get into here today. This will be a more of a condensed version of our normal presentation. We can kind of cater things to what product or products you're more interested in, and how they can really help drive value at your particular location. So please feel free to reach out to your territory sales manager or to me or Glenn Howell, who's also part of our technical support team, to get something like that scheduled. Calcium Products was founded in 1987. The founder of the company was in the limestone business, and as part of that, he made some of the limestone for feed grade for livestock, and there was always a waste stream coming off of that, a very fine powder that they weren't able to use in the livestock mixtures. And so he had always had this vision: there's got to be a better way to utilize that material instead of just having to kind of throw it away or put it in the ag lime pile or what have you. And so he developed as one of the first people in the Midwest to develop the pelletizing process. And with the help of some folks in the industry, he was one of the pioneers in this industry back in the late 80s. He sold the mine to Martin Marietta at that time and started Calcium Products. And he had that fine stream of material available to him to start doing the pelletizing process. And so that was really his vision that founded the company. That there's got to be a better way to approach liming of agricultural fields, and that's really what spearheaded the whole beginnings of Calcium Products. Primarily, we're in the agricultural arena, row crop production. We do also exist in the professional turf markets. Some of our products are made into different sizes for those types of markets. And at the core of all of this, really for us, is our relationships with you folks that are here in attendance today, and really trying to figure out where your pinch points are and what we can do to help provide a value and a service to you and your growers that will help everybody be more successful. It's interesting to note just a little bit of geological history here in this part of Northwest Iowa. Calcium Products' administrative office is located here in Ames, Iowa. Our manufacturing facilities are located in Fort Dodge, where we do primarily pelletized gypsum manufacturing, and then also in Gilmore City, which is a little bit further northwest of Fort Dodge, where we do primarily all of our limestone or 98G pelletized limestone production. Moving back millions and millions of years ago. Hearing that we don't have sound again. I hope that's not the case. Just double check something here. Check. Looks like it's okay on my end. Okay. Thank you, Glenn, for confirming that. When we did this on Monday, we were having an issue with the sound. So anyway, looks like a couple folks have confirmed that. So back to the geological history here. hundreds of millions of years ago, when the continents were a lot closer together, and everything was closer to the equator, there were inland seas that existed in about the western half of Iowa, roughly speaking, of course. And what that brought was a lot of dissolved minerals in that water and a lot of sea life, a lot of calcium carbonate-based shells that were on that sea life. As those continents started to drift apart, as those seas started to recede and evaporate, all those minerals that were dissolved in the water and all that sea life, all those shells, created these very rich beds of different types of minerals throughout northwestern Iowa. One of those being calcium carbonate limestone, the other being calcium sulfate gypsum. And then fast forward another 100 million years or so, there was a meteorite that hit up near Manson, Iowa, which is in the general vicinity of our manufacturing facilities. And that pushed some of those materials up closer to the surface. And so when the area was settled in the later 1800s, there were these outcroppings of limestone rock that created that industry in northwestern Iowa. A little bit later on, gypsum was discovered. It wasn't as close to the surface as some of those limestone mines were, but so we've got extremely pure materials that we're able to use as the base of our raw material for the production of our products, and that really gives us a step above the competition. And we're very fortunate to have access to those very pure raw materials. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on here. Couple things I'd like to point out here on our website. We've got a lot of technical information there. You can see, up here, this would be kind of your home page, looking at the home page here. If you drop down the products tab or the dealers tab here, you can get down to this technical information button that you can click on, and that will show you a whole host of information that we've gotten here that Glenn and I and the team have put together over the last several years. We've got things all the way from our bag labels, OMRI certification, product comparisons, overall product manuals that are really kind of a deep dive into both products and the science behind them and how they work. Spec sheets, research briefs. This is where you're going to find all of our trial data, kind of summarized into individual research briefs, SDS sheets, and then our various different cell sheets. So there's a lot of information on there. If you need a quick reference as you're having a discussion or thinking about something in this arena, you can go there and should be able to get what you need pretty quickly. Of course, we always appreciate the opportunity to have a discussion with you on the phone or in person. So start there, but if there's something that you need in a pinch, you can certainly get that from our website. So we'll go ahead and start with the SO4 pelletized gypsum. And again, we really try and focus mainly on the sulfur side of things with this product, because in the Midwest, a lot of people have heard the term gypsum over the past, and its normal connotation is associated with soil amending, which is great and which is true. But in the Midwest, where we tend to have a lot of calcium in our soils already, there are only specific types of areas or scenarios that will have a benefit from the soil amending side. And the good news on the sulfur side is that it can be successful in all types of soils and in all crops. And so that's really why we put the focus on that versus the soil amending side of things. So again, it is made from pure mined gypsum. This gypsum is about 94 to 95% pure that we get out of Fort Dodge, Iowa, which doesn't exist in very many places in the world. When it comes to minerals like gypsum and limestone, they tend to be considered sparingly soluble materials. Obviously they're not synthesized, they're not man-made, and so the solubility is what nature makes it to be, which is good news on the gypsum side of things. On the limestone side of things, it's even less soluble than gypsum. We'll talk about that as we get there. But in order for us to make these pellets work as good as possible and to actually be able to pelletize them, we've got to put them through our proprietary grinding process. So we take the raw material, the rocks, and we put it through a grinding process. We end up with about 80% of it passing 100 mesh. And that's important, again, for the pelletizing of it, but it's also very important for the solubility of this material and for it to actually release the sulfur how we want it to and how the crop needs it to. We pelletize it, and this pelletizing really is a balance between having a pellet that's strong enough to hold up in the agricultural distribution channels, but also soft enough to dissolve once it hits the soil. There's a very fine balance there of putting too much binding material and things in there to where once it hits the soil, it won't do what it needs to do. And so that's something we've worked on for the history of this company and continue to work on every day and bring new improvements and engineering opportunities into our production process to really help promote this balance. So there's two main things that we're going to kind of highlight about SO4 and from an agronomic perspective today that I would really like for you to remember about the products. And these are two of the real hallmarks of SO4. One being that it's a pH neutral sulfur source, which means that it does not acidify or raise, so it doesn't lower or raise the pH of the soil. So you're not getting the limestone activity, obviously, where it would raise the pH of the soil, and you're not getting the acidification component either. I'll talk more about what causes that acidification from other sulfur sources here in a few minutes. The other one that really is the one we should probably focus a little bit more on is this ideal solubility. So, when we think about fertilizers, particularly from a nitrogen management standpoint, we know that nitrate is a leachable nutrient. It's a negatively charged nutrient, and most of the soil charges are also negative. And so, like charges repel each other. And so as that nitrate works its way through the soil, it kind of gets pushed down and is very leachable. Sulfate is the same way. It's also negatively charged, and it also has very high leaching potential. And so we think a lot about our nitrogen management program and putting out nitrogen at multiple times during the season. Not to say that some folks aren't doing that for sulfur, but by and large, it doesn't receive near the attention that our nitrogen management program does. And what we're here to tell you today is that SO4 offers a solution to that problem. And really provides a lot of value in terms of providing sulfur at the right time throughout the season for the crop to take it up. The guaranteed analysis on this product is 21% calcium and 17% sulfur. Again, this exists in the calcium sulfate form, so there's no nutrient transformations that have to take place in order for that sulfate to become available to the crop, and the calcium is there for either the crop or the soil, whichever the kind of more in need area is. So when we talk about uptake of sulfur throughout the growing season, I alluded to this a little bit on the last slide, but the uptake pattern of sulfur, and for a lot of nutrients for that matter, is a very season-long uptake. It's not that it just needs it in the beginning of the season or the middle or the end. And as you can see on the graphs here, so some research from the University of Illinois showing the uptake pattern of sulfur in corn and soybeans. And you can see that after the reproductive phase has been initiated, 50% or more of that total uptake of sulfur has to occur after that happens. And so, we tend to put sulfur out in the fall or in the early spring. And, unless you have a real sandy soil, typically you're not worrying too much about the rest of the season for that. But it is something we should put some credence to and definitely be concerned about. We want to have a sulfur source that's out there providing sulfur throughout the growing season for that crop to meet its needs all the way up until harvest. So again, nitrate leaches and so does sulfate. It's the same kind of deal there. So we've got to be concerned about losing that sulfur, especially if it's an extremely soluble material fertilizer that we're putting in there. So this information, when we first discovered it, led us to putting it together a research project with some rain simulation onto shallow soil cores. The reason we did shallow soil cores is we wanted to try and mimic the soil solution chemistry. So as these different sulfur sources are being broken down and solubilized by water, what does that release pattern look like? How much of the sulfate is being put into the soil solution at any given time throughout the growing season? So we tested all of the traditional sulfur sources, elemental and AMS, also some co-granulated products, and also some different synthetic pelletized gypsum products as well. And what we saw here, we've always preached that SO4 has the right kind of solubility. We've seen it in our research data historically, but we really wanted to try and put some proof or some evidence behind that statement. And this is exactly what we found. And this particular project now has been replicated several times by independent sources to help us verify all of this. So you can see that this dark blue line represents the ammonium sulfate. It's important to note that ammonium sulfate is about 300 times more soluble than gypsum or SO4 is. And so we would expect that it takes less water to break that down. So you can see that in that first month of application, nearly all of the sulfate has been dissolved into some sort of soil solution. It doesn't mean here, this line does not mean that in the second month after application, you could shift this one way or the other depending on when it gets applied. But at that second month after application, it does not indicate that it's all been leached out of the soil. It just means that it's been put into a position in the soil solution where it's going to be susceptible to leaching throughout the remainder of the growing season. So you can see that that happens very early on in the season, and it's something we should be concerned about, particularly with some of the larger rain events that we get that are more common nowadays, can really do a good job of flushing some of this already dissolved sulfate out of the soil. Co-granulated product is the next line here. So it's got MAP and ammonium sulfate plus elemental sulfur. The claim being that the AMS component of this is going to release early in the season, which it does. You can clearly see that with the line. But then the elemental part is going to release later in the season. You really don't see that taking place. And for anyone that's studied elemental sulfur, they know that it takes, generally speaking, a couple of seasons for it to become completely oxidized and available for that crop to take it up. When you look at elemental sulfur, again, you're getting a really small contribution here, which actually we theorize came from the organic matter in the soil, not the actual elemental sulfur. Pelletized synthetic gypsums have a lot of additional binder in them because the starting point, the raw material, is a much finer granule size than what we do with SO4, and so it needs additional binding agents in order to help it pelletize correctly, and so it takes a lot longer to break down and never releases the same total amount of sulfate that SO4 does throughout the growing season. Now you can see, last but not least, SO4 sits right in the middle of all these, and it's the exact thing that we've been claiming all these years, that it has the right release to meet the crop needs. Go back to this slide just for a second to remind you that it's a season-long uptake, and we need greater than 50% of that to occur after reproduction has been initiated. So looking at SO4, it's got a nice early season release. And again, it doesn't mean that this is all that's left in the soil, but it means that it's still releasing sulfate into the soil all the way throughout the rest of the growing season. So that's very important to think about when we think about the crop needs, putting the right type of sulfur out there to meet the crop needs. And again, it's something you can put out once and you don't have to worry about doing additional applications of sulfur throughout the season to meet that demand. One additional thing to point out here, we talked about the acidification potential for different kinds of sulfur sources. The starting pH was 5.9 with these soil cores. You can see that the pH dropped pretty significantly with the co-granulated product. That's largely because there's MAP in there as well. And then for the AMS soil core, that also dropped a few tenths of a pH point. We'll talk on this next slide about why that is. So when we look at this acidification piece right here, what we're talking about with ammonium sulfate, and this is a common misconception in the world of sulfur, is that the sulfur is what's driving down the pH of the soil. That's true with elemental sulfur because as the elemental form, it's not available to the crop. There are different microbes in the soil that have to oxidize that elemental form to sulfate in order for it to be available for the crops to take up. That is an acidifying process. So as that the elemental gets converted to sulfate, it releases hydrogen into the soil and creates acidification. The real answer is a little bit more complicated than that, but that's a very basic explanation of it. Same kind of thing with ammonium. So this is on AMS, it's the ammonium that creates the acidity, not the sulfur, because it's already in the sulfate form. So we don't need any transformation of that to be available to the crop. So as that ammonium converts to nitrate in the nitrification process, again, that's a acidifying process in the soil and one that does acidify and degrade the soil. So you don't get any of that from SO4 because, again, the calcium is stable. The sulfate is relatively stable, and so they stay in those forms, and there's no transformation process that creates acidity in the soil. Again, on the solubility piece here, you've got rapid on one side and very slow on the other, and SO4 sits very nicely in the middle. So we've explained all this in terms of solubility and acidification and things like that, but the proof is in the pudding, as they say, and we've got a lot of data with SO4 that shows its efficacy and its performance as a sulfur source. We've got data going back to 2006 when Iowa State started using SO4 as their choice of sulfur source to conduct field trials in Iowa. So some of you, many of you, I'm sure, have been in agriculture for a while and have seen this paradigm shift with the adoption of sulfur as a kind of the fourth big nutrient in nutrient management plans. And so This all started in Iowa anyway. I know it's been different in other areas that have traditionally seen less sulfur, but as our air started to get cleaned up from the Clean Air Act of 1993, I believe it was, what happened was plants that emitted sulfate or sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, coal burning industries of various sorts, primarily power plants, and more so in the eastern corn belt. But some of that sulfate worked its way back to the west in the atmosphere and got put down as acid rain. Some of you may remember the scares back in the 80s of acid rain. What came with that was a lot of free sulfur fertilizer for farmers. That has been relatively cleaned up now. You don't see very much sulfate falling down on fields anymore like you used to. And so that has really been the primary driver towards this paradigm shift in adopting sulfur as a normal component of our fertilizer management plans. So this all happened in Iowa around 2006. Well, it happened earlier, but this is when farmers really started to observe maybe this isn't nitrogen deficiency. Maybe there's something else going on here. As we put more nitrogen out there, we're not seeing the response that we think we will. And so alfalfa was the first crop that started showing significant sulfur deficiency in around 2006. Corn followed shortly after that. And so they used SO4 primarily because it's a good, reliable sulfur source, and it doesn't have the confounding effect of nitrogen in it. And so you can isolate that sulfur effect a lot easier with SO4 than you can with AMS or something else. And it's more readily available from a sulfur standpoint than the elemental is. So anyway, long story short, over the course of all of our trial work, we've got a little bit over a 13 bushel increase, and this is not just Iowa State data. This is involves all the trials we've done as a company, leading up till harvest last season. So we've got a lot more trials out this year, as we do every year, to try and grow our database. Average application rate is right around 150 pounds per acre. That gives you right about 25 units of sulfur, which tends to align with most of the discussions we have with dealers these days. And of course, not using any sulfur is going to be a significant impact on your overall yield goals. Soybeans are another crop. So that was obviously all corn that we just talked about there, as corn was the one, kind of the initial crop, along with alfalfa, that showed a lot of sulfur deficiency. And one thing you can think about with corn in terms of where that sulfur deficiency exists is with nitrogen, it shows up on the older leaves on the bottom of the plant. With sulfur, it's going to show up on the newer leaves coming out of the top of the plant. That all has to do with the mobility of those different nutrients within the plant, and that's exactly why we see the differences that we do in where that deficiency symptom shows up on the plant. They look the same, but they show up in different parts of the plant. Soybeans are something we've started to put some research pressure on here over the last couple of years. I know it says 1998 here, but that was one trial that we were able to dust off that existed from a long time ago, well before I was with the company, but we were able to add that one in there as well. But this has primarily been over the last 3 or 4 years that we've been doing these trials. You can see kind of an outline map here where we've been doing them. Also showing a nice yield response with the SO4 on soybeans. This has been something that's growing in popularity with our dealers, providing a different management plan for soybeans compared to how we've done them traditionally. A 2.7 bushel increase that we've seen on average with soybeans. So again, a growing area, growing crop need for sulfur as soybeans for sure. This is a trial I always like to point out. It's one up in north central Iowa that we did back in 2017. This all kind of spearheaded because of a grower that met us at a trade show or heard about our product at a trade show and came back the next year and said, I've tried AMS, I've tried elemental. I know I've got deficiency on my farm. I'm not seeing much of a good response out of them. I've seen some, couple bushel here or there, but not what I expected to see. He tried SO4 the following season and got a 30 bushel increase. Now, I'm not here to guarantee you that you're going to see a 30 bushel increase, but the thought to me is that it's got the better release pattern. It's got some calcium in there that can be beneficial in certain scenarios on clay side hills, which he had a lot of on his farm, and seeing some benefit from that release pattern, from the lack of acidification, and potentially some of the calcium benefit as well. And he saw a much better response with SO4 than he did with the other sulfur sources he had used. So he had the research farm that was just north of his place had not been conducting any sulfur research, and they decided to put some SO4 out to see what they would see as well. And they also saw a 30 bushel increase on this trial. And so, I think certainly there's something to speak there with the differences in how SO4 provides the sulfur and potentially some of that calcium interaction as well. This is just another shot of that same trial once it got a little closer to completion there on the right. This is another trial I like to point out, particularly on sandy ground. We know that there's a lot more potential for leaching. Some of your more coarse textured soils, lower in organic matter that have a higher sulfur demand and are frankly a lot more sensitive to which sulfur source you put out there. SO4 showed a clear advantage over AMS, and certainly the sulfur demand of this soil is quite high, being low in CEC and low in organic matter. But you can see spring application of both of these, and you can see a significant improvement with SO4 over using AMS here. And you can see in the pictures of the trial a clear-cut difference to where you've got the SO4 applied. It's got a better release pattern that, again, better matches with that crop need all the way throughout the growing season. I promised you we'd talk a little bit about the soil mending side here. So I'll just preface this by saying this is a lot more anecdotal than, all the scientific proof we've got from the solubility, the pH, the release timing we've got on the performance side of SO4. All these different bullet points here. We're not going to go through all of them, but this is where we generally see response from growers. And we get it every year. We hear this every year from people, from a dealer or a grower, or a handful of them, I should say, where they've got these types of areas where we tend to see some improvement in how the soil performs, whether it's better infiltration, better drainage, better tilth. Those types of things tend to be the reports that we get from folks that are using it. Maybe it's been used as a sulfur source for a lot of years, and so you continue to kind of accrue those benefits of calcium over time. Or maybe it's where they've put it out at a higher rate and really tried to target that benefit from the calcium, where they've seen these benefits. So generally speaking, this is involving clay in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's tight soils or soils that are high in magnesium that also have a clay component to them. Sodium that comes from manure or irrigation water. This one where it's sodium, whether it's a sodic soil, irrigation water, a manure-based sodium contribution, that is all very scientific. We know that gypsum is a great way to ameliorate or amend sodic soils, and so that's one that we do have a lot of good information on. These other areas, again, I would kind of urge you to try them on an as-needed basis. Start small and big. Use those areas as kind of a testing point for you to look at slightly higher rates, maybe in the 300 to 400 pound per acre rate, to see if you can drive some of those benefits in areas that need it. So with SO4, we do have, and this is probably the other hallmark of this product, is that it can be applied at literally any time of the year, and you're going to see the benefits and the release pattern be what you need it to be. And I know it sounds a little bit too good to be true, but the reason that it's a good fall application product is because as the temperature starts to go down, the gypsum solubility goes down. So that pellet is going to sit there and kind of wait until the right conditions are present for it to start breaking down and releasing that sulfate. That's not the case for ammonium sulfate. And of course, with elemental, you want that to break down throughout the fall. So you're actually potentially going to get some of that sulfur contribution in the spring. So, and we still hear of a lot of people that put AMS out in the fall. It's more convenient. It breaks down the corn stalks. There's all kinds of claims that none of which hold much scientific weight. But we do see a lot of AMS application put out in the fall, and that's really, if you're going to compare a fall application scenario, or even a spring one for that matter, SO4 is a much better choice in terms of what we've already talked about with the release pattern meeting the crop needs. Certainly can be blended if needed. And the other nice thing about SO4 is it can be put out in the spring too. It's certainly, we have lots of dealers, we're about 50-50 right now, I would say, with folks that put it out in the fall and folks that put it out in the spring. There's various causes for that. Can be related to soil type, convenience, labor, whatever the case may be, but you can put it out either time of the year. And a lot of that data from Iowa State that we shared earlier was actually from top dress rescue applications. So they waited to find fields that had known visual confirmed sulfur deficiency. And they went out and put the SO4 on as a top dress application at V5, V6, V7, somewhere in there, and we're able to see a response to that application in as little as 3 or 4 days. So there is the flexibility with this product that you can use it, anytime really, for it to be fit into your system, whatever works best for you. So again, another very beneficial aspect of SO4 compared to other traditional sources. This was a fall application that was put out just a few years ago up in north central Iowa, and we put near LeGrand. The dealer put 100 pounds here on the left side of the dotted yellow line and did not put any sulfur out on this side. Again, fall application, and this is even a little bit lower than we typically recommend on corn. So there's less sulfur there to kind of play with, if you will. So again, you can see that leaching potential over the fall and in the spring just isn't there. And so you've got that great advantage being able to put it out in the fall if that's something that fits into your system. Confirmed with tissue tests. I mean, you can obviously tell by the visual difference that there's more sulfur in the crop that received the SO4, but we confirmed that with some tissue testing as well. So certainly no heartburn should be experienced on your side when looking at using it as a fall application. So this looks at kind of an adjusted cost basis, and we've talked about all this stuff already, and so this is kind of putting the whole picture together and how you look at how SO4 performs on a cost per acre basis versus AMS. And we really do have to take all these things into consideration. We can't just look at the cost per ton and say, hey, we get a little extra nitrogen and that gives us a benefit. It's not a fair way to look at it. It's not comparing apples to apples. And so when we look at some of these things we've talked about today, yes, AMS has nitrogen, so we're going to give it some credit for that, right? We're going to use, whatever nitrogen source is appropriate to give that credit. But it also leaches nitrogen and it leaches sulfur and it acidifies the soil. And so there are costs that are associated with that affect the bottom line of the cost per acre. If we take away some of these nutrients, we've got to attribute that cost back to what's left over. So yes, even though you do get a nitrogen benefit, and this is looking at a fall application scenario. So these numbers for a spring application scenario would probably be cut in half, but there's still that leaching potential in there that we have to consider when we look at the cost per acre of these applications on this adjusted cost basis. For SO4, it's pretty straightforward. There's maybe just a little bit of a soil mending benefit in there. We don't, it's a $2. It's not a big deal per acre. So when we look at the overall adjusted cost basis, you can see that there's a significant advantage for SO4 versus AMS when we look at it like this. And again, this is really taking all the science and the information we have available to us and comparing these in a way that's more reasonable than just saying, what's the cost per ton? What's the cost per ton? How does that break out on the sulfur side of things? There are other things we need to consider to make that a fair comparison. And this is something we can take your specific information. I know this is not going to, these exact numbers aren't going to apply to everybody, but we can take your information, work with your territory sales manager or work with Glenn and myself, and we can develop this economic value proposition for you to take a look at with your team, for you to take a look at with your growers, and really provide them with the necessary information to make the right decision. So I've gone a little bit longer on this section than I planned to, but when we kind of boil this down to the main selling points at the farm gate for sales agronomists, it really kind of comes down to this. It's the ideal solubility. Obviously, I've stressed that a lot, but I can't stress the importance of that enough. We've got to do better about making sure that we've got sulfur available to our crop. If we want to maximize that yield environment, we know that sulfur is a critical component of that, and we need to make sure that that sulfur is out there all the way throughout the growing season. We're not going to lower the pH of the soil. We're not going to have a degrading impact on that nutrient availability for everything else that's there. The calcium can be beneficial to the soil. So we've got, an overall net benefit to the soil rather than an overall net, subtraction from the soil like we would with something that lowers the pH. When we look at that adjusted cost basis, we've got a significant advantage on the cost per acre compared to ammonium sulfate. The return on investment, we've proven this as a reliable sulfur source. You don't have to have any concern about it performing as a sulfur source. I mean, I know some people, I should say, aren't used to using sulfur coming from gypsum, but we've proven it over a lot of years that it's a very reliable and very consistent sulfur source. So there really shouldn't be any concern about that. And I would say if you've got some folks that still are not on the sulfur bandwagon, put them on some SO4 and they'll be true believers after that. And that's a great way to convert people that don't currently use sulfur. I know there's not that many of them left anymore, to folks that really believe in it in their crop and their return on the investment. And then last but not least, we just talked about this, but the application flexibility really is an important part of this product. It gives you, as an operations team and agronomy team, a much easier decision process in terms of when this can go on. Let's put it out and get it done. So that's what we've got for SO4. I think we'll go ahead and switch gears over here right into 98G and start talking about some of this. So with 98G, again, we're looking at both correction and maintenance of soil pH. Predominantly right now, we're putting a lot of our weight into maintaining of soil pH, and we'll explain why that is as we go along here. Similar story on the 98G side of things. In terms of how we produce it, it's made from a 98% pure calcium carbonate. That's where the name 98G came from the 98% purity and the G for granule. So we make this out of a very pure source, again, just like we do with the gypsum. We have to grind this one a little bit finer. I talked about the sparingly soluble nature of limestone earlier. In order for limestone to work, it needs acidity and it needs to be very finely ground. And so to get the best sort of bang for your buck and to utilize every single particle of that liming material that we're putting in there, we really need to have it as fine as possible. So once that pellet hits the soil, it starts to break down and you start to get that pH correction happening immediately. So what we're left with is very efficient correction and especially maintenance of soil pH. So we've alluded to this already in the previous discussion, but anytime we put out ammoniated nitrogen sources, we're going to get acidification. So whether that's anhydrous, urea, AMS, MAP, or DAP, it doesn't matter what type of ammoniated nitrogen source we put out there, we're going to get acidification from that. And this is the biggest driving cause of acidification in agricultural fields, is the amount of nitrogen we're putting out there. I'm not trying to shame people or anything, but I'm just trying to help you understand that this is why we get acidification over time. There are natural causes that do it as well, but predominantly the nitrogen management, especially of corn, is what's driving this. In other regions, it's things like canola, but in the Midwest, it's corn. And so we're seeing a lot of acidification occur because of that. And so our whole idea with this maintenance program is, we know we're putting acidification out when we put nitrogen out. Let's also put some 98G out there to offset that acidification in real time, and not have to wait until this becomes a bigger problem down the road to address at that time. So our based on the research trials we've done, the science we've studied, this is where we currently are with respect to our maintenance program for 98G. Again, we want to neutralize the active acidification that's being put out into that field with our nitrogen management. For each unit of nitrogen that gets put out there, we're going to put out 1 pound of 98G to offset that acidification that comes from, again, the ammonium to nitrate conversion. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. It's as simple as it can be. We don't want anything to be complicated or misunderstood about this. And so we've made it as simple as possible. And really the research data that we've been able to generate on this lines up very, very well with that 1-to-1 ratio. Again, we're really thinking more about this being a proactive pH management solution, not a reactive pH management solution where we're looking at it every 4 to 5 to 6 plus years where, oh shoot, we've got pHs way lower than we want them to be. We better go put out 3 or 4 tons of ag lime that we might not get to for 3 or 4 seasons. So again, this really is trying to focus on the problem now versus later. And we're really starting to treat this more like a traditional fertilizer application. So more frequent, lower application rates. Again, around 200 pounds per acre has been our traditional application rate with this program, our average application rate, I should say. This allows for more application flexibility, allows you to use your current fertilizer spreading technology, can also allow for some micro bin or some blending possibilities, and ultimately gives you longer term benefits in your nutrient management, crop, maximizing your yield environment and your overall liming program, better long-term benefits. This whole idea was started back in about 2017. We were doing some rate trials at this site up in southeastern South Dakota. And what we saw was as we increased the rates, we saw increases in the pH, but we did not see increases in the yield after about 500 pounds per acre. And so this led us to say, maybe we're thinking about how we do these applications with 98G the wrong way. Maybe we need to treat it more like a lower rate, more frequent application where we can reap benefits in that year of application, keep our pH more stable, and again, provide those longer term benefits. And so since we've initiated this maintenance trial program in 2017, we've been able to hone in on what that rate is. And again, it's that 1-to-1 ratio. Every unit of nitrogen gets a pound of 98G put out to offset the in-season active acidification that occurs there. Currently, we're seeing about a 10.3 bushel increase. And again, this would be on ground that's either at or below 6.0 predominantly. And there certainly is something to be said about the nutrient use availability there. Excuse me. As we acidify the soil, the availability of a lot of the different nutrients goes down. This is particularly true with phosphorus, which is obviously a very important nutrient in all crops. So as we're making that soil more acidic, we're making that phosphorus less available to the crop. The crop has to work a lot harder, has to exude different types of chemicals in order to get access to that phosphorus, and that impacts the yield of the crop. So if we can make those nutrients more available all the way throughout the season rather than just doing it once every 4 or 5 years, when in those interluding years it's hard to determine exactly what happens there, but we do know that we've got a tangible yield benefit with these applications. And so obviously there's some sort of nutrient availability increase or stabilization that's occurring with these types of applications. So we're very happy with what we've seen in terms of the research that's been done here. Switching gears over to soybeans, again, this has been delayed a couple of years behind the corn, even though soybean is traditionally thought of as more of a pH sensitive crop. Corn was the one that showed and still does show the greater return on a percentage basis, but we also see a fairly nice, almost 3 bushel increase on soybean doing this as well. But important to note that the acidification is primarily coming from the nitrogen that we put on the corn. So you're managing this in one of two ways. You're either taking care of that acidity right after the season before the next soybean crop, or you're taking care of it during the season with the corn crop. We're still working on some trials where we're doing it every year to see if there's some, continual benefits. But certainly if you're going to put it out with corn, offset that acidification, you're going to be putting that soybean crop in the following season into a better scenario too, where there has not been a season of acidity built up leading into that soybean crop. So definitely some residual effect going on there too. Now, when we look at soils that are a little bit more towards a neutral, but still on the acidic side, this is some trials that we've been doing at the University of Illinois for the last couple of years. I'm just going to share this briefly. It's a little bit technical, but what they were trying to do with this study, I should say, is try and answer that question of, well, we don't want to put our phosphorus and our lime out at the same time because it's going to get tied up and we're not going to have the availability of that phosphorus. So this really was a trial that was designed to try and answer that question, say, yes, you don't want to put those two out together. We've always been proponents of that it doesn't matter. All the scientists that I've talked to in my career here at Calcium Products have said that it's probably not a very big deal. You don't need to worry about it. And that's exactly what the University of Illinois found too, but they also found synergistic effects between pelletized limestone, our 98G, and different phosphorus rates. So this is some very important research to help us answer this question of what's happening at a molecular or a micro scale in the soil that's helping us provide these yield increases with 98G being used as a maintenance rate. So you can see this soil is a pH of 6.4, so you probably wouldn't worry about it on the liming aspect one way or the other, which is really important to note here. And so I'm just going to share a couple of quick graphs here. That there was no overall reduction in phosphorus availability, and in somewhere between this 200 to 400 pound rate, you saw the greatest availability of phosphorus in that 0 to 6 inch depth. And so you can see there was an incremental increase at 0 phosphorus when you had 40 pounds of P2O5 out. You saw the best increase with a 200 pound rate. And again, when you're up at 80 pounds, you saw, again, a stepwise increase with rates of pelletized limestone being put out. The other interesting thing is looking at the grain yield here. So when you've got zero phosphorus, it becomes even more important that you've got enough limestone. And their theory here with this is that you've got some better mineralization taking place that's helping the microbes, having them sit at a better pH level. It's more favorable towards their activity, which is helping to mineralize that phosphorus and make it available to the crop. The organic phosphorus, where no phosphorus was applied that season. When you look at 40 pounds that's been applied, again, you see a significant increase with just having 200 pounds of that 98G in there. When they put out a lot of phosphorus, it didn't matter quite as much, but certainly, a lot to be said for what's happening in this microenvironment with 98G to help that plant get more access to phosphorus, which again is the exact opposite of what they thought they were going to find with this trial. So a little bit of a serendipitous discovery that was taking place alongside our other maintenance trials that's helping us answer this question. But again, this is a soil that's got a pH that's closer to neutral. And so, I think there's something very similar to this happening at lower pH soils, but it's probably having a bigger impact overall on all of the nutrient availability, not just the phosphorus. And even, the other thing that's kind of interesting to note here is people don't think that you're going to do a lot of pH change with these lower rates. And it's not a huge amount, and we wouldn't expect it to be, but you do see some increases in pH even with the 200, 400, and certainly the 800-pound rates here. So there's good news on both fronts. You're getting better grain yield, you're getting better phosphorus availability, and you're getting some slight pH adjustment out of this whole thing. But certainly our goal is just to keep the pH where it's at with these maintenance rates and not have to go on this roller coaster ride all the time. Excuse me. Looking at another study that Iowa State conducted back in 2018, our whole goal with this one was to try and prove to people that the state scoring system, and some people say, I got this ag line with these different characteristics. I want to go put out some 98G, what's the scoring system say about what's your ECCE value, and can I make the comparison based on that? You really can't because the state scoring systems in most of the Midwestern states stop at 60 mesh. That's the kind of the high end of where you get benefit from finely ground materials. As I showed earlier, we have a significantly higher amount of our product goes through a 100 mesh screen. So we don't get any benefit from that on the state scoring system, but we know that the finer the material is, the more it's going to react and the better it's going to be at changing pH. And again, helping that nutrient availability be better to the crop. These systems are all based on 100% pure calcium carbonate, which is this green line here. So if we apply the state scoring system, which generally includes the chemical purity, the fineness of grind, and the moisture content, if we account for all that, we should be able to use a formula that gets us to that green line, no matter what liming material we use. As you can see in the study, 98G was the only one that came even remotely close to performing like the 100% pure calcium carbonate did. So it turns out that the scoring system works okay for 98G, but it severely undercuts the amount of limestone that you need. And so what this tells us is that traditionally speaking, we've probably been severely underapplying limestone to our fields from the standpoint of ag lime. Dolomitic limestone performed even lower. Interesting thing to note about dolomitic limestone is, it has a certain percentage of it exists as magnesium carbonate. It's not all calcium carbonate. That's why it's called dolomitic, because that means that it has some component of magnesium carbonate in it. Magnesium has a lower molecular weight than calcium does, and so pound for pound, magnesium carbonate has more carbonates in it, and that's what adjusts the pH of the soil. So on paper, dolomitic limestones have a higher overall neutralizing value, chemical neutralizing value than calcitic ag limes do because of that magnesium carbonate component. So on paper, it looks good. In reality, in field trials and in these types of trials, it shows that you need more of the material in a much longer time to achieve the same kind of results as you do with calcitic or especially 98G. So at the end of this trial, calcitic was 0.7 units. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but in the world of pH, that's a huge difference. It's a logarithmic difference, and an entire unit of pH below was dolomitic ag lime from where 98G ended up in this trial. And so there's a few things at work here. Obviously, the state scoring system doesn't do a great job of accounting for the differences between these materials, but it also shows that 98G was much more rapid to react and a much longer reactivity timeline before these other two plateaued out. You really never see the plateau occur on 98G. So had this study been conducted longer, it's possible that would have matched up with the green line, while these ones were done reacting in a pretty short time frame. And so that also tells us all that coarse material that we think of um, as a slow release liming mechanism really is a no release liming mechanism. Those coarse particles, we're paying for them, we're spreading them. They're really not doing much of anything for us in terms of changing the pH of the soil. So when we look at some grower profitability from this 98G maintenance scenario, again, we're looking at this. It could be done in different ways, whatever fits in with your operations and with your growers. You can certainly put it out at different times. We've got it being applied out with the corn. The rough cost here of the 200-pound application, again, this is going to differ for folks depending on where you are and what your prices are and whatnot. But we can again work with you to put something specific together for you that you can share with your growers to help drive these conversations and to help promote the usage of 98G in this maintenance type fashion. You can see over the course of factoring in the cost and the yield increase, you can see a very nice profitability for the grower per acre over that traditional 4-year liming period. And that's why we put it in this 4-year scenario here, is because that's traditionally 4 to 5 years is what we see in a normal liming period. So if you've got soils that are close to a 6.0, which tends to be kind of the recommended level from most of the Midwestern universities as far as where you should sit at or above for your corn and soybean yields to be their best without having to apply too much extra liming material. This can be a really beneficial way to keep that pH close to 6, even if it's a little bit under, and keep providing these yield benefits over the course of time. So there are some other pelletized limestones out there on the market. Obviously, we're well aware of that. There's about 3 different ones that we tend to run into more than any. One out in western Iowa, one in northeast Kansas, one over in Indiana. The thing you've got to remember about these, and while there might be differences in the price, there's also differences in terms of how pure the raw material is. And there's differences in terms of how finely these materials are ground before they get pelletized. You can see this one on the left here. These are both broken down versions of 98G and this Western Iowa pelletized lime. There's a lot of very coarse particles in there. So this really is more of a pelletized ag lime versus a pelletized lime powder like 98G is. That affects its overall ECCE score and its performance in the field. And so you can see that, you've got 20, and 10% difference compared to the overall efficiency of 98G here. So when you look at a pounds equivalent rate, and some of them have magnesium in them too, which you've got to factor into the pound equivalent rate. And you can see that there's a clear difference in the application rate here. And so while there might be a cost difference when you factor in the extra material that has to get used, a lot of times we're either at or below the cost of these other competitive products. So something that certainly needs to be considered when we're looking again at just the price per ton versus the price per ton is not a fair comparison with these either. Operational efficiencies. We hear more and more every year about how inconsistent ag lime is, particularly from an availability standpoint. We work in the lime business also, and so we understand that there's headaches with ag lime pile availability at different rock quarries. The purity is very inconsistent. The particle size, particularly in an ag lime pile, ag lime is a waste product from the milling of other rock sizes that are used for road base and construction and things like that. So ag lime never has a consistent size. It's always going to be a little bit different. And again, if we go back to this slide, the more coarse particles you get, the worse off these slopes on these lines are going to be. And so that's a very important thing to have consistency like you do with 98G. You know what you're getting, you know how it's going to spread, you know how it's going to perform every time you use it. Variable moisture content, spreadability, we've already pretty much addressed all that. Fewer trips across the field, you're able to take better use of your existing equipment, your existing labor. You don't need 3 or 4 people to go run an ag lime crew like maybe you did. And, the frank matter is too, this is, it's a product that drives better profitability for growers and dealers as well. Application flexibility also exists with 98G. Fall or spring application is perfectly suited. Again, we're about 50-50 in our trade areas where people are doing it in the fall or the spring. Um, I tend to think fall is a better opportunity for putting 98G out. It doesn't have any, sort of leaching potential or anything like that. If there's acidity in the soil, that carbonate is going to offset it. Doesn't really matter if it's in the fall or the spring. And so if you've got a scenario where it's better suited for you to put it out in the fall, that's perfectly fine to do. Can be blended. We do have variable rate equations for 98G on both the corrective and the maintenance side of things. But again, we try and keep it very simple with the maintenance rates of the 1-to-1 ratio. Every unit of nitrogen gets a pound of 98G to offset that. And really what we're looking for and really trying to promote are more frequent lower rate applications, treating it more like a fertilizer application and getting a more of a tangible fertilizer benefit out of this. And again, we're all focused on nutrient availability, taking advantage of all the money that growers put into that nutrient management program, taking the best advantage of it we can, and really helping to maximize that yield environment every single year. So again, boiling this down to a condensed number of bullet points to discuss with growers at the farm gate. More rapid and complete pH change versus ag lime. That's backed up by that Iowa State study that I showed you. The maintenance and correction of pH is much more precise with 98G. We didn't talk much about spreadability, but putting pellets out for a liming application is a heck of a lot more precise than putting a powder out. Everyone's experienced that cloud of dust behind the ag lime spreader, or a rock getting thrown through a spreader window or a farmer's window or whatever it might be. There's just a lot more precision locked into 98G when it comes to liming applications. The maintenance program showing a very good return on investment, and continues to prove itself out with all of our research trials. And when it comes down to looking at, correction of pH with 98G versus ag lime, this is something we didn't talk a lot about today, but if you want to get into that discussion with us and provide us with some of the information about what limestone you're using, what your costs are, and compare that to 98G, when we look at what the difference is in application rate, the differences in the timing of getting the pH corrected, and the impact that has on the yield and the profitability for the farmer, 98G can be and often is very competitive with ag lime in that scenario as well. And so if that's something you want to have a discussion with us further about, I would urge you to reach out to your territory sales manager, and we will get your information and provide that back to you in a usable format that you can discuss with your team internally or with your growers. So there's a lot of good information there as well. And again, I would urge folks to reach out to your territory sales rep or to myself or Glenn Howell and get something scheduled. We'd be happy to come out and meet with you and get things rolling. So in summary here, SO4, superior sulfur release. We talked a lot about that. pH neutrality and application flexibility. Those are really the three hallmarks of SO4 when it comes to comparing it against traditional sulfur sources. 98G, we're all about improving that nutrient availability by offsetting that active acidification in our maintenance program, consistently maximizing that yield and precisely doing it with the placement of the pellets. So with that, looks like we're right about on time here. So I really appreciate everyone's attending the webinar today.